thanks so much for that introduction, George. And thanks, of course, to Dean Robertson and the College of Arts and Humanities for inviting me to give this talk. It really is it's an honor to be able to share this kind of research with you all. So, I'd like to start by answering a question that I know at least one of you has, and I'm sure maybe others of you have as well. Why is someone in the English department talking about patents and computing and the future of technology? I was going to outline my background, but George did that for me. But one thing I want to point out is, so I've got a degree in German studies. I worked as a public radio reporter for a while. And then I moved to the Twin Cities in Minnesota and floundered a bit. I eventually found work as a technical writer where I worked at the University of Minnesota in the networking and telecommunications department, where I documented phones, including the voicemail system. This is super exciting stuff. So I made things like this. So we could, if we were in a tech writing class, I would explain to you why that's terrible documentation. It looks pretty, but it's bad. So I'm going to make that go away. And what I learned is that really quickly is that I needed to training in this, or I needed to learn how to do this. So as George mentioned, I went back to school while at the University of Minnesota, and did an MS and then a PhD program. While I was writing my dissertation, I got a contract gig as a tech writer at Best Buy, which is also based in the Twin Cities, and there I documented smartphones, which was almost as exciting as documenting voicemail systems. Our goal was to write sort of 10 basic tasks for every smartphone that Best Buy sells. You can imagine they sold a lot of phones and there wasn't a whole lot of variety in these tasks, but we created this knowledge base that helped them support those phones. While I was working at Best Buy, I wrote my dissertation on the patent dispute between Google and Microsoft in their smartphone patent wars. So you might think that I had this unhealthy obsession with phones at this point. I do find phones interesting in sort of a bizarre sort of way, but what really drew me to my dissertation topic was an interest in how open source software might challenge existing methods of collaboration and innovation. That's what I was hoping I would find in my dissertation. I ended up finding something a little bit different, but that's all right. Also, anyone who's playing along at home might notice that I don't have a degree in English. So rather than asking why this guy's in the English department, I think the real question is, why did the English department hire this guy? And I'll let you ask my colleagues in the English department about that. Yeah, so being in the English department, what I do is I teach rhetoric and writing. And one of the things I have my English 301 students, that's rhetoric for professional writers, is they write out a problem statement to sort of set up an argument that they're going to make. So and I have a student from one of my classes in here, and in the interest of demonstrating and sort of, what do they say, eating my own dog food, I wanted to go over the parts of a problem statement, if you'll bear with me. So here are the parts, right? We've got the status quo. I guess I've got this. You don't need me to point at that. The status quo is the way things currently are. That's defined. Then we have this destabilizing moment. Now, this is the place where the problem becomes apparent. If there's no destabilizing moment, then there probably isn't a problem, and then we don't have anything to argue about, so we can stop. Then we ask this question, so what? So this is a place where we try to connect with our audience on terms that they care about. There are plenty of destabilizing moments that I really don't care about. For example, my son might try to frame an argument that involves his bedtime flashlight not being quite bright enough. But there's little for me to care about in this so what, so I'm unlikely to act in the way that he wants me to. But thinking about so what might not translate into specific moves. We might not write down so what in our argument, but it leads us into this idea of the next move, which would be consequences. And that's basically what happens if we don't deal with the destabilization of the status quo. What's at stake? And then the solution is what we can do to address that destabilized moment and address the problem, fix the problem. When I teach this to my students, I like to point out two things. They've now fleshed out a pretty good introduction to an argument or even to a paper, and that this solution statement should really look strangely like a thesis statement for a paper. So again, if you'll bear with me, we'll go through the status quo of my problem. So what might this problem statement for a patent war between Google and Microsoft look like? Well, as I said, we'll start with the status quo. Now, the patent system in the United States is rooted in what's known as the Copyright Clause. I prefer another name for it that you see sometimes. It's called the Science and Useful Arts Clause. And so this is a little screenshot of the Constitution, and then this is the part I'm interested in. This is Section 1, Article 8, Clause 8. Yeah, Congress shall have the power to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive rights to their respective writings and discoveries. And this is the part of the Constitution upon which intellectual property rights, such as copyright, trademark, and patents are all based. And so you're probably familiar with this. The purpose of a patent, for example, is to grant the inventor a temporary monopoly in exchange for full disclosure of the inner workings of the invention. So this is meant to have two benefits. The inventor has the opportunity to profit by the fruits of his or her labor without having to worry that a competitor is just going to swoop in and steal the idea. And then competitors also have the opportunity to learn about and make improvements on the design of the original invention. And ultimately, the public is meant to be the beneficiary of the Science and Useful Arts Clause because the public gets to enjoy the resulting system of robust innovation. Okay, so now the destabilizing moment. This happens because at times innovation gets bogged down in the patent system itself. It doesn't always work the way it's meant to. So this is patent artwork from Alexander Graham Bell's patent application for the telephone. And this is a lovely photograph of, it's an actor portraying Bell because the photographs hadn't been invented yet, but it's an actor portraying Bell speaking into his telephone. Both of these images are from the public domain, by the way. When the telephone was invented, it was really quickly adapted and quickly imitated, and Alexander Graham Bell found himself spending more time defending his invention than inventing new things, and he was an inventor at heart. He became so frustrated that he resigned from the head of his company and retired to his lab so that he could work on his inventions. I would point out that he invented the metal detector. That was as he was trying to find a bullet in President Grant, who'd been shot. And then he among other things, and he invented a photophone, the photophone, which is sort of a precursor to fiber optics. He figured out a way to transmit sound over a beam of light. So it's a good thing he went back to the lab, right? And then just another illustration of the destabilizing moment at play here. This is a drawing from an early patent filed by Edwin Land. He's the person who invented the Polaroid camera. This is Land himself showing a picture of himself using this technology here. So I just love like this sort of meta selfie moment here, that he invented this and then he used it, and then it's this huge Polaroid. Yeah, so this is another example of invention. And just to back up, this is a really big deal in photography. Instant photography seems really mundane today. At that time, the only way you could see but at the time this was invented, the only way you could see a picture you had just taken was to take it into a lab or a processing center, wait days, maybe even weeks for it to be processed. Land spent decades working on this technology, and it caught on, of course, like wildfire in the marketplace. But again, Polaroid had to spend vast amounts of its money to fight off patent infringers, including a major patent war with Kodak. Kodak wanted in on this. Now, it's interesting to note that while Polaroid was busy fighting it out with Kodak in the 1970s, digital photography came along, or at least the early precursors to digital photography came along, and made film, even instant film, even Polaroids, completely obsolete, or nearly completely obsolete. I think it's difficult to support a claim that the patent war with Kodak caused this lack of foresight, but you have to wonder what might have happened if the company had been able to devote more of its resources to innovation and less to defending its intellectual property. All right, so, oops, that's the laser. Now I'm going to try to talk about the so what. Why should we care about the patent system and its relative merits or shortcomings? More importantly, why should you care about these things? Well, I would argue that even if we aren't inventors, we live in a world that's increasingly dominated by technology. And also as educators, we need to realize that our students will leave this place where we educate them and go do work for companies that develop new things and new technologies. And the ways in which these things are created will be of crucial importance to many of our students. We have to help prepare them for this. So that leads me to consequences. And I would argue that the consequences are that if we don't attend to and try to understand these types of questions about the nature of invention, that means that we run the risk of leaving our students underprepared for technological environments in which they're going to work and live. In other words, we'll be leaving them without an important tool for citizenship in the modern world. All right, so now to my solution. How How do we better understand the ways in which we collaborate? Well, I'm a rhetorician, so for me the solution's clear, rhetorical analysis. And I promised something that would look like a thesis statement, something like this. A close analysis of persuasive documents involved in this dispute helps make clear how those documents shape the ways in which we think about innovation and technology. But I want to back up for a second because rhetoricians tend to suffer from the Maslow's hammer problem, which is that when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So we can solve everything with rhetorical analysis because we've got this great hammer. So I want to back up a little bit and sort of justify that way of investigating these problems in context before I plunge right into it. So to do this, I want to rely on a philosopher named Andrew Feenberg and help sort of sketch out what he calls a critical theory of technology. So Feenberg suggests that if we're interested in understanding how technology impacts human lives, we need to take a critical view of technology. And what he means by this is that technology is neither neutral nor does it have its own agency. It's someplace in between. So let's talk about neutrality. The idea that technology would be a neutral tool, it's often referred to as instrumentalism, and it's the kind of thinking that leads to guns don't kill people, people kill people. Feenberg argues against this viewpoint, against instrumentalism that is. He would maintain probably that yes, humans bear responsibility for the ways in which they use tools, but we also bear responsibility for the possibilities that we build into our tools. So yes, people use guns to kill people, but guns seem to be really good at killing people and less good at making homemade noodles or other things that tools are built to do. The second part of Feenberg's critical theory is in some ways the opposite. You might think of them as ends of a spectrum. And this is sometimes called technological determinism. Feenberg calls this substantivism. So if we take a substantive or deterministic view of technology, then all agency is given over to the technology itself. So under substantivism, technology becomes more than one cultural factor among the many that define the course of human development. It becomes the most important factor. So this is the kind of thinking that leads to the sort of illogical but often fantasized conclusion that technology will become autonomous and ultimately control everyone. This leads to wonderful science fiction like Skynet and the Terminator, the idea of the singularity where our technology will sort of rule us. So as an antidote to the extremes of instrumentalism and substantivism, Feenberg offers his own critical theory of technology, which sees here, and this is this third bullet point here, as technology as a process. So it's something that's sort of ongoing, and it's ambivalent, and it's suspended between possibilities. And I just love the word ambivalent here because it points to the fact that we build values into these technologies. So then the question is, how do we attempt to understand these values? And again, rather than dive right into rhetorical analysis, I'm going to go to another philosopher. This is Charles Taylor, and he's got this idea of social imaginaries. So in Taylor's words, a social imaginary is the ways in which people imagine their social existence and how we fit in with others. So it's important to sort of recognize that this idea is normative and probably dialectic. So for example, Taylor suggests that the economy functions as a social imaginary. The economy is normative in that you have to participate in the economy. It's impossible or very, very difficult to opt out. But it's also affected by the actions and beliefs of all the people that do participate in it. So I like to try to illustrate this again with another little story from one of my kids. I was dropping my son Cass off at school, and we had a nickel and a dime in the car, and he said, why is the dime worth more than the nickel? Because the nickel's so much bigger than the dime. And I tried to look up the answer to this, and there's historical reasons for this, but I mean ultimately the reason why the dime is worth more than the nickel is because we all believe that the dime is worth more than the nickel. At least that's what Taylor would argue. If we stop believing that, it ceases to be true. And the housing bubble of a few years ago points to that. We stopped believing that our houses were worth more and more and more, and they stopped being worth more and more and more. There's probably more to it than that, but that does point to the fact that the economy and other social imaginaries are in large part built on our beliefs about them. Also, Taylor argues that social imaginaries are connected with what he calls genres of possible action. So as a rhetorician, the idea of tying genre to action is very appealing to me. So let's think about what this means. We might consider what it means to participate in a public protest. We know that public protests involve certain kinds of actions. We collect with others in public. We hold signs. We chant slogans. We can imagine a similar group of people might do some of the same things. They might congregate in public, but then they might do actions that are sort of outside the genre. So if we move from collecting in public, moving through the street, chanting slogans together, if we move from those genre actions into other actions like breaking windows or looting stores, then this collection of people has stopped being a protest and it has started to be something else. It's become a riot. But the thing is that we don't consult the guidebook for civil disobedience to find that line. We learn it from each other. We learn it from stories that we hear about protests that we've been to or others have been to. We learn it from the pictures in the news. We learn it from the legends about protests, making great social change through public protest. So this is where Taylor says the social imaginaries are carried in images, stories, and legends. So this starts to sound like something that an English professor might really be interested in because we're interested in images, stories, and legends. Next step for me is to figure out what to study. So in my research, I'm interested in the rhetoric of technology. And here I'm going to lean to what's sort of one of the original people who sort of pioneered this field, and his name is Charles Bazerman. He describes this as the rhetoric, the discourse, the written and spoken artifacts that accompany technology and make it possible. It's the rhetoric that makes technology fit into the world and makes the world fit with technology. So clearly this points to a very broad definition of the term rhetoric itself. For this to make any kind of sense, rhetoric needs a definition that's similar to, Aristotle's definition. He defines rhetoric as the ability to see the available means of persuasion in a given situation. That's true. Another way of thinking about rhetoric here would be possibly to define it as any sort of use of symbols aimed at getting people to act or think differently. I think that maybe brings it into the modern world a little more clearly. So for this body of research, I looked at a sample of the public discourse, the public rhetoric that surrounds various aspects of the patent war between Microsoft and Google. So just a quick sort of narrative of this. I guess we'll calling it a case at this point is a little bit too loose, but narrative of what happened here. So this patent war started on October 1st, 2010, when Microsoft sued Motorola, actually, over infringements in their Android phones. Motorola then countersued, and within about a year, the conflict involved 50 patents. And so this patent analyst, Florian Mueller, put together these diagrams to just show how this conflict just ballooned really, really quickly. In the summer of 2011, Google reached out to Motorola to buy their patents. They wanted just the patents. They didn't want the whole phone-making business. Motorola's CEO declined because he said without having patents, they wouldn't be able to defend themselves in the courts. So then Google turned around and just bought the company outright in August of 2011. A few years later, Google sold Motorola to Lenovo, but kept the patent portfolio for themselves. So if you want a bunch of patents, just go buy the company, then sell the company, but keep the patents. They also kept the lawsuits because when you buy a company, you often keep its liabilities, unless I suppose you can sell those. Then in 2015, Microsoft and Google settled and dropped all of their litigation, agreeing to collaborate on some patent matters. And it's kind of fuzzy what they agreed to collaborate on. They haven't disclosed financial terms for the deal, but they said we're done suing each other over this. So the stuff I look at is actually sort of early on in this because, as I was doing the research for this, it was sort of midway through the patent war. So I had to pick sort of an endpoint in order to complete my work and complete my dissertation. So the first piece here is from a blog post, and I've actually got a handout, because what lecture from an English professor would be complete without a handout? This is the post in its entirety. This is taken from very early in the patent war. This is a press release that Google's chief legal officer at the time, David Drummond, he wrote this while they were in the thick of their negotiations to purchase Motorola. And you can go back and look at the SEC filings and sort of reconstruct what was said when to the company and then what was said to the public. And it's just fascinating to try to figure out sort of the timing of this message. So in this, Drummond decries the use of patents as weapons that stifle innovation. He also describes the Android operating system as an ecosystem. So you can see this stuff is really rich with metaphor. And there's this wonderful tension between images of warfare and images of ecosystems, and that just jumped out at me right away when I started looking at the metaphors here. So traditionally, the role of metaphor and rhetoric has been seen as recasting of the unknown into the realm of the known. That's how we learn new things. And this idea of metaphor as explication has been really well documented in the rhetoric of science. But when I look at it, and I'm thinking of this in terms of the rhetoric of technology and how this document sort of makes technology work and makes us work with technology, it seems that metaphor is doing something else here. So I turned to Lakoff and Johnson, and they offer this idea of the conceptual metaphor as one way of understanding how metaphor shapes our experiences of the world. It's not just how we learn about new things, it's how we actually live through the world. And they have this really often cited example to demonstrate conceptual metaphors, and that is argument is war. So imagine that as a sort of way of understanding what argument is. They make it really clear that this particular conceptual metaphor does more than describe a stylistic flourish of arguments. It's not just making the idea of arguments seem prettier. It shapes the actions that we can take when arguing. They write, we can actually win or lose an argument. We see that the person we're arguing with is an opponent. We see them as an opponent. We can gain ground. We can lose ground. We can abandon a position or take a new line of attack. So clearly, these sort of war-based metaphors in the patent war itself, and when patents attack Android and that sort of thing, it calls similar actions to mind. If someone fires a shot at your company and you're thinking of this as a war, there are certain actions that seem to make a lot of sense. And it might seem that the best action if someone is shooting at you is to shoot back, metaphorically speaking. And that seems to be what happened when we look at the quick escalation of this patent war. But I think even more interesting is when Google executives, or when David Drummond uses the term ecosystem to describe the complex of software and hardware that make up Android. And so here their language relies on a different kind of conceptual metaphor. This is one that Lakoff and Johnson call an ontological metaphor. So ontological metaphors are often used to conceptualize boundaries where none actually exist. So an ecosystem might seem difficult to put boundaries around, but if we reconceptualize this chaotic system of human interaction as an equally messy but essentially self-contained system of natural and organic interaction, then Android as ecosystem helps us stake out some conceptual boundaries around the texts and technologies involved. I think the ecosystem metaphor also illustrates Android's status as an inherently rhetorical system. Again, it's a system based on writing. In this sense. It can't exist without a really complicated and interconnected system of texts, things like software itself, licensing agreements, patents, and so on. And then these texts have to be interpreted and applied to an equally complicated system of hardware, as things like computer chips, touch screens, batteries, etc. Now, to be sure, hardware creates affordances for certain kinds of writing. In other words, computer chips make it really easy to write computer code. But hardware is also completely useless on its own without writing. A computer chip that doesn't have anything written on it is it's basically just like sand, right? Silicon. I'm not sure what silicon is made out of. Yeah, and then finally, the Android ecosystem also functions as sort of a metaphorical black box. This is sort of in the sense that those who use the metaphor might prefer that we don't open it up and look too closely inside. It is possible to peer inside the Android ecosystem black box and see the variety of applications, advertisements, the way private data is used, and all that stuff. But proponents of the ecosystem metaphor seem to prefer that we not look too closely. If we just call it an ecosystem, we don't have to peek inside. So by presenting the system as this ontologically bounded black box, Google can simply point to these threats to the ecosystem rather than allow or sort of open up the unraveling of the various concerns that users of the system might have. And then finally, it's helpful to turn back to Feenberg's critical view of technology. So if you describe technological systems and processes as being inherently interrelated, that might be helpful for understanding those technologies. But I think the view risks becoming overly deterministic because an ecosystem metaphor might depict the technological system as having a predetermined outcome. In other words, the system seems to evolve according to its own rules, sort of organically, and not sort of how we're, according to how we're building values into that system. So that's sort of unit of analysis 1. And then this becomes unit of analysis 2 is, it's about licensing agreements. I know, super exciting. So I've got to back up and talk about licensing agreements for a little bit. So I looked at the ways that Microsoft and Google talk about licensing agreements in which patented technology is written into a standard. So without standards, pretty much nothing on your phone would work. You can imagine a phone that relies on non-standard technology for everything from making phone calls to taking pictures. And that technology might be better in every way. Your voice might sound better, the pictures might look better. But what goes a phone if it can't talk to other phones? You have to conform to the standard in order for it to actually be a phone. So in many ways, standards and patents are really at cross purposes. So for producers, if you standardize things, you can help increase economies of scale. That benefits consumers through lower costs. It also helps them build things that work, which is nice. They reduce format battles like the VHS and Betamax thing that happened so many years ago. They benefit computers. They prevent us from getting locked into a format or technology that then vanishes from the marketplace. So standards are beneficial in many ways. But standards can also make it really difficult for this new but superior technology to gain a foothold. So again, consider this phone with a way better, vastly superior voice technology, but it can't talk to other phones. So by way of contrast, intellectual property rights such as patents, those help us invent that better phone. Patents are designed to create new things, but they don't really help us standardize old things. Finally, we need to talk about sometimes they're called RAND agreements, sometimes they're called FRAND agreements. It's a lovely acronym. But these, FRAND or RAND stands for free, reasonable, and non-discriminatory. So these are agreements that are put into place when a patent, the technology in a patent is then written into a standard. So if a company develops this great way of getting cell phones to communicate, and now they've patented it, and they can get that written into a standard, that's a beautiful thing for the company because now everybody has to use their patent. And you could imagine an example, and this has happened, this has definitely happened. Motorola did this with the GSM standard back in the 90s. They had the patent, and they sort of became like the cell phone manufacturer because everyone had to use their technology. So FRAND agreements are meant to sort of balance that out, and they say, well, if we're going to write your patent into the standard, you have to make it available to your competitors at either free or at a reasonable and non-discriminatory price. You can't use your technology to shut people out of using the standard. So it's meant to sort of balance out these two ideas that are at cross purposes. So in theory, these agreements should balance intellectual property rights and the need for standards by giving patent owners at least some kind of fair compensation for their property, but preventing any single patent holder from dominating the market. But when you look at the rhetoric that surrounds this particular dispute, it seems clear that even FRAND agreements can only ease this tension so much. And so I was really interested in the ways in which Microsoft and Google talk about these commitments. And in doing so, I uncovered two trends in my analysis. So I found that generally speaking, those parties in the dispute that benefit from maintaining sort of the status quo of standards agreement, keeping this system in place, they tended to use metaphors that saw patents as an economic engine. Finding art that shows an economic engine is extremely difficult. So there's an engine, it's got the word economy on it. But better would probably be to just point to a particular passage. And I'm not going to hand out another handout because this was a much broader selection of blog posts for this one. But here we've got Microsoft's General Counsel Brad Smith and their Deputy General Counsel Horacio Gutierrez talking about licensing agreements. The agreements prove that licensing works. Intellectual property continues to provide the engine that incentivizes research and development, leading to inventions that put new products and services in the hands of millions of consumers and businesses. And that the economic engine metaphor shows up a lot when people talk about intellectual property and these sorts of agreements. By way of contrast, those with an interest in disrupting the patent system tend to use language that creates a sense of rhetorical communion with the audience, and most often through the use of illusion. So this idea of rhetorical communion comes from Perlman and Ulbrecht's Titeca, these rhetoricians, they're modern rhetoricians from the mid-20th century. So communion in this sense is kind of like solidarity, in that it's one of the forces that holds community together. But according to Perlman and Ulbrecht's Titeca, rhetorical communion performs a constitutive function. In other words, rhetorical communion helps take a constructive role in the forming of the community itself. Communities don't exist before the language that is used to describe them. They actually exist, at least in part, because we use language to describe them as such. And again, one of the key ways that speakers and writers can create communion with their audience is through the use of illusion. We'll get to Ben Franklin in a second here, but I want to point out that the other two ways, according to Perlman and Ulbrecht's Titeca, that we can create communion with our audience is through maxim and proverb, which we see a lot, and also by inviting the audience to participate. So raise your hand if a speaker has ever tried to get you to participate in a lecture. Thanks. Couldn't resist. So in the sample of documents I analyzed, I read illusion as efforts to recall the historical roots of invention in the United States itself. That's why we're looking at Ben Franklin here. Most often this comes by pointing to Article 1, Section 8, Clause 8 of the Constitution. They'll just go right back and refer us to the Science and Useful Arts Clause. But occasionally these allusions also point to our most famous founding father and inventor, Benjamin Franklin. I think I've got a passage here. Yeah, so this comes from the Google side of things. Many of our nation's founding fathers, most notably Ben Franklin, were inventors. And from America's earliest days, we've been a country that has promoted innovation. Here they want to keep the patent system in place. So I read these allusions as an effort to enlist the support of the community of scrappy American inventors sort of against the standard system, since these FRAND agreements essentially take what's in a patent and give it away at a sort of mandated price. This image is also from the public domain. If it's from the public domain, you're supposed to let people know. So ultimately, I believe that these rhetorical choices point us to two really different ways of viewing patent-based innovation. If patents are simply cogs in the economic engine, then they can be bought and sold on the open market, and there's really nothing special about the invention itself. And I think this would be the view of intellectual property, something like the way we think about commodities. So if you buy, I've never bought wheat as a commodity, but if you buy wheat or those kinds of commodities, you don't actually buy any particular grains or stocks of wheat. You buy a specified number of bushels. On the other hand, if invention is the stuff of inspired heroes like Benjamin Franklin, then each patent has this inherent value that's just sort of been painstakingly and magically almost instilled in it by the inventor. Now what's interesting about this is that Google had to change its stance on this question as they went from sort of patent poor to patent rich. Originally they avoided rhetoric that tried to equate patents with commodity, but then they ended up buying Motorola because they really needed a bunch of patents. Then they stripped it of its patent portfolio and they sold the phone part to Lenovo. And then after that happened, and of course I'm not trying to imply causality here, but it's interesting that after sort of things lined up for the two sides, they agreed to a licensing deal. So in many ways, I see the final upshot of Microsoft versus Google as a reinforcement of sort of standards and patents, a reinforcement of the status quo. And I think you can get there to that conclusion through sort of looking at the rhetoric and how we came around to this. And then other patent analysts have agreed that Florian Mueller, that patent analyst who put together those awesome flowcharts, he calls it basically just maybe a slight win for Google, but really a win for standards essential patents because that system stays in place. So what's next for the future of innovation? And how does this play into that? Well, I believe that the patent system will continue to see challenges, but I don't think that the most interesting challenges are going to come in the courtroom anymore. I think the most interesting challenges are going to come outside of the courtroom. It's really interesting as I sort of finished this research and continued paying attention to what these companies are doing. Some of them are turning away from patents as they develop radical new technologies. One example is the electric car company Tesla. Elon Musk famously blogged a couple of years ago that all our patents belong to you. Does that make sense to anyone in this room? Yeah. Couple people, yeah, right? I don't want to insult anybody. This is a really nerdy allusion to a video game meme that dates back to the early 90s. So, and we'll look at that in just a second, the concluding slide. But two things jump out at me at first glance. When he invokes this meme, Musk, if we're thinking about illusion as a rhetorical communion, I think Musk is working really hard to create rhetorical communion with his audience. This seems to happen fairly often when high-tech CEOs, Larry Page did this, referring to sort of nerdy phones when he was talking about the patent war. Larry Page of Google did this a lot. When they want to appeal to their scrappy computer programmer audiences, they do something like this. I'm a nerd just like you. But interestingly, Tesla isn't actually giving the patents away under any kind of like open source licensing agreement. Instead, they've simply told other car makers that they can use, you can go ahead and use that technology in the patent, we're not going to sue you. As long as you use it in good faith, we're not going to sue you. And I'm not really, I don't know what to make of this handshake deal yet. It seems like kind of a wink. If I were a car maker, I wouldn't invest a lot in using somebody's patent without something in writing. That seems pretty straightforward, but apparently some car makers are starting to do that. So I'm really interested. The next part of my project is going to be taking a look at how the rhetoric of this chapter seems to shape it. And then the second area where I think we'll see open source ideas coming into more direct challenge with patents is in artificial intelligence software, oddly enough. Several companies are open sourcing their AI code. Interestingly, Google has released its AI system TensorFlow under the Apache open source license. And just as interestingly, Microsoft has released its system, the CNTK toolkit, under a serious license. I went through and read this license, and I'm not a legal scholar by any means, but it seems to be a very serious and legitimate open licensing agreement. Now, there might be a really pragmatic reason to do this. It's really apparently quite difficult to patent an algorithm, and much of AI boils down to algorithms. But they could have chosen other ways to protect their intellectual property. Trade secret would be one way where they could just lock up the code and not let anyone see how it works. And instead, they have decided to make it open. And I think the initial rhetoric here, and this is early days in terms of trying to figure out how this plays out, but the initial rhetoric here seems to indicate that the decision was made for the sake of expediency. In other words, they say they're open sourcing their code so that AI systems will be better sooner, and I'm definitely putting better in scare quotes. Because if we take Feinberg's critical view of technology, this should make us pay attention. The assumption underlying arguments about expedience and efficiency is that all progress will be a good thing, but many technologies, of course, have unanticipated consequences. I'm still not sold on whether it's a great idea for us to all have the internet in our pocket. Even though I try to get my students to use them productively in class, I'm still working that out for myself, actually. I'm probably just old-fashioned. But at any rate, it remains to be seen how open source licensing is going to affect artificial intelligence research. So there's the meme, all your base are belong to us. So. Any questions? Sir?
So I guess it was 2013, Microsoft bought Nokia for almost $8 billion. 3 years later, they sold it for $335 million.
That sounds about right.
I guess they forgot they were not a hardware company, they were a software company. But what strikes me as odd about that is Microsoft is not stupid, but anybody who knew anything about phones in 2013 knew that Nokia had an inferior product to almost every other manufacturer.
Mm-hmm.
They totally missed the boat on smartphones. How does a company that successful do something bad?
You're asking me to talk way above my pay grade. If I could, I have no idea. I remember seeing or reading about that deal going through, and a lot of people really confused by that. I haven't tried to study that transaction or what happened there in a serious or sort of systematic way. If I had to guess, it seemed like at about that time, Google partners with hardware manufacturers in interesting ways, where sort of one manufacturer will do the Google phone this year, another one will do it next year. Apple, of course, sort of dominates its hardware, and I think Microsoft was trying to find some other way to get in on the act. But yeah, I don't have an answer for that question. Mm-hmm.
You said that you find it important for educators to be aware of this, to kind of pass this information on to your students. So what does that look like in your classroom?
Well, I think it's a matter of if we're going to talk about technology in the classroom, and we're going to talk about the rhetoric of technology, and we're talking about the rhetoric that supports and makes us fit with technology, makes technology fit with us. It's a question of not just stopping at here's how to write documentation, and it's a matter of talking about the importance of words, right? Different words. I was at a conference presentation last month where this wonderful scholar said she points out to her students sometimes different words mean different things. And that's definitely true, but also different words do different things. Because if we see rhetoric as language in action, language that gets people to do things, then understanding how the words we choose, the language we choose shapes those actions is really important. So I think it's a matter of moving classes from how to some aspect of more thick understanding of what they're doing. Yeah. Tyler.
So the legal system in general and patent law in particular is notorious for very exact kind of like language where they're coming in kind of sometimes manipulatively, sometimes just trying to be very precise in what they're saying. So this idea that Elon Musk says you can use this in good faith, is that a shift in the direction of patent rhetoric, or is this kind of a one-off?
I don't know yet. It's early days for me with that part of the project, but it feels to me, if I had to guess, it feels like a one-off because it's crazy that he would say that, and it would be crazy for anyone to invest heavily in that kind of agreement. It would seem to me to just be absolutely crazy. So it's fascinating to me, but I don't know exactly how that plays into like any sort of broader trends. If you're gonna, because when that happened, everyone said, oh, Tesla open sourced their patents. And then you go back and read about it, and they didn't open source anything. They just they took their patents down off the wall, and I think they put this up, right? Okay, but yeah, I don't know. Lisa.
You got my attention when you used an environmental metaphors.
Uh-huh.
You're talking about the ecology and metaphors there. So how is that? Can you go back to that example and talk and explain how that using that metaphor would make action different than if you used another metaphor in that document?
Yeah, I mean, I just find it, I get the hairs on the back of my neck go up when people talk about technology as ecosystem, because I see ecosystem as this natural thing that actually does evolve according to its own ways. And a set of technologies that are not evolving in any way, that aren't doing anything that people don't tell it to do, doesn't equate to ecosystem at all for me. And so that's where I just get concerned at the use of that metaphor and what sorts of decisions and values that enables for people that are working on these things. So yeah, I don't know that it affords any particular sort of action. I worry that maybe it affords a certain kind of non-action. So if this is just part of an ecosystem, then I maybe give up agency over it and instead just sort of deal with what it has to give me. Yeah. Hmm? George.
Yeah, you mentioned, was Motorola the one that set the standard for cell phones?
Well, the GSM, they helped develop the GSM technology, yeah.
Was there a competing company trying to develop the standard like, well, you had HD, high def, and you had Blu-ray, and one.
Yeah, I've read a little bit about that. I haven't dug too deeply into the history of that. Motorola was able to set this contribute heavily to this GSM standard, which was taken up really heavily in Europe. If you've got T-Mobile or AT&T, you've got a GSM phone, but it's not real big here. So yeah, and I mean here the other standard is CDMA, and I'm not exactly sure how standards essential patents played into the development of CDMA, but Motorola's contribution to the GSM standard is one case that's been sort of well storied.
They never sold two cell phones, what I mean is there were never two standards going at once.
Like VHS and Betamax?
Yeah.
Well, no, there still are today. Right, if what have I got here? This is a cheap sort of reseller of Sprint, so this is CDMA. If I switch to T-Mobile, I'd be using a different standard.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and that's why it's sort of hard to move. Well, I mean, that's part of why it's hard to move. Yeah, they both work, but CDMA has, it's been much more successful in the American marketplace, I think. Yeah, sure. Hmm? Gary.
So I've just been mulling over the ecosystem analogy, and I'm thinking maybe it has more going for it than you were thinking. I mean, in an actual ecosystem, organisms, of course, are a major part of the ecosystem, and they build and shape the ecosystem. They do things to it, they change it, which have flow-on effects. If one could see the companies as analogous in some loose fashion to the organisms, they are building and shaping that ecosystem. They're doing that in competition. Like organisms, they're trying to survive, which means in the, the economic sense, trying to build products that make them money and allow them to continue to exist and make more products. So I don't know, just
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, you could cast that or see that metaphor in a friendlier light than I do. I find myself skeptical of equating that kind of organization with a natural organization. For me, I think it's something more. It might be a knee-jerk reaction. Because to me, it just stands out as, a company is not an individual. A company is not a forest, right? It's a human organization, but I get uncomfortable when it becomes made equal with things that it seems not to be. It seems to open up disturbing possibilities for companies. All right. Well, thank you, everybody.